Okay, so here we go with the cephalopods, the last group of mollusks. We're going to look at who they are and also how they're different from the gastropods and the bivalves. So the cephalopods include the nautilus, the cuttlefish, the octopus, and the squid. They've been around for, maybe 430 million years, and the nautilus were the first ones to arise, and then from there the other three groups came about. There's about 800 existing species these days. They seem to be increasing in biomass as climate change and overfishing are taking place in the world's oceans. These creatures range markedly in size, from the small, really small blue-ringed octopus to the giant octopus here, which can be 7 feet across from tip to tip. And then, of course, there's the giant squid. And the giant squid, which we'll see in class in video form, can be up to 60 feet long from the end of the tentacles to the end of the mantle itself. So really remarkable. And the tube part of the mantle may be 20 feet long on the larger ones. So very large organisms. Generally speaking, they're short-lived, although that's not true for the nautilus, but many of these organisms live a year, some even as short as 3 months, some, like the giant octopus, about 3 years. Some, like the nautilus, have their shell on the outside here. Others, like the cuttlefish, have their shell on the inside, so there's a plate-like, almost bony-like structure inside the cuttlefish called the cuttle bone. The octopus has the smallest remnant of a shell. You can see it here in this diagram. It's called the skull here. Other people will call it the cap. The cap here. And that cap is the place where the muscles actually anchor. The head muscles do on the octopus. And then finally, the squid have a pen, and this is what the pen looks like if you take it out of the squid, and it runs along the dorsal side here of the mantle cavity, and you'll get to pull one out in your lab. So one of the biggest shifts here, aside being called the head-foot organisms, is the fact that their mantle has undergone marked change. So outside of lining the shell and creating the shell in many of the other mollusks, the mantle has become highly muscularized, and it is their organ of propulsion, and it's also their organ of communication. Here on the nautilus, it's tucked inside. But all of these have a mantle that's become highly muscularized and highly vascularized both. Here you can see that the mantle forms a tube around the rest of the organism, and the body wall of the internal body structure is inside the mantle. All the structures and organs are there. But what you eat when you eat calamari is the rings of calamari are actually the mantle tube. And there's good reason for the loss of the shell and the muscularization of the mantle. This is how they move, by jet propulsion. So they've become lighter and more agile. The squid in particular, the octopus not quite so much, although they can really glide along and jet themselves along. They also have a funnel, and you can see here on the octopus a picture of the funnel, drawing of the funnel here. And those funnel, that is the adapted siphons from the bivalves, has become this little jet propulsion mechanism. Here you can see the funnel right there. What happens is that the organism opens up its mantle, highly muscularized, really opens that up, draws a lot of water in, and then it jets the water through the funnel and out in order to create propulsion. The octopus also uses it as a tool. It can clear debris away from its den with this funnel. It can also scare other organisms away. It can also use it as a broom and clean things up. It's quite a little adaptation for them. In addition, the foot of the previous mollusks has now become the arms for these cephalopods. Each group of cephalopods has a different number of arms. Some of them have extended arms, which you might call tentacles, but the arms have evolved from the foot of the previous kinds of mollusks. The cephalopods have become quite skilled predators. They're what we might call raptorial predators because they actually actively move after their prey, and they've got some pretty remarkable adaptations for all of this. And you can see they've got sucker discs on their arms and tentacles. All right, they've got this big massive beak here, which is a really powerful beak that they can use for capturing and piercing prey. They've got that very sharp radula. Some of them actually have some poisonous toxic material in their salivary glands that they use to help paralyze prey as well. Here's an example of squid capturing prey. You can see here that it's going after this relatively small item of prey over here. But if you look up here, this squid is capturing a nice sized fish. Sometimes the squid take on prey much larger than themselves. And here you can see on this squid that there are the arms, the shorter arms that are here. There's 8 of those. And then there's these 2 tentacles that they use for feeding. And so the prey is out in front of the organism in panel number 1, and then it will literally fill these tentacles with blood, and they shoot out and capture the prey here. Then they'll draw it back into the mouth area, chew it up with the beak, and tear it apart with the radula and swallow it down into the digestive system. So clearly the loss of the shell or the diminishment of the shell has made them much better at being raptorial predators. As I just mentioned, those sucker discs allow them to actually help hold on to potential prey. They are highly covered at the ends with nerve endings so that they actually taste through the sucker discs and figure out whether or not this is good potential meal. You can see the texturization and color of the skin here. This allows it to hide and lie in wait, in particular the octopuses, which is the right way to say this, do this. And, as we said before, they've got this highly muscularized mantle. They've got a jet propulsion system, including the funnel, that actually can allow them to move quickly. All right, and they have these very highly adapted eyes, so they're really good vision. And as we said before, the funnel comes from the in-current, ex-current siphons, and the arms. Those eyes are remarkably well adapted for all kinds of vision, in particular color vision. You can see here, this is Clyde Roper from the Smithsonian Institute, and he has the eye of a giant squid, which he actually keeps in a little preservative here in the jar. And you can see the eye here. This is an octopus eye, and this is a squid eye. Slightly different from one another, but still quite sophisticated and markedly similar to the vertebrate eyes. So the squid beak and the octopus beak are one of the most amazing things. You can see the relative size of some of these. It's really quite large. Looks a lot like a parrot beak. It's made out of chitin, right? That very hard protein carbohydrate material that is similar to the external shells on crustaceans. So here we can see the beak and the radula in place in this particular organism. You know that their radula is highly pointed in many of the structures, really good at tearing food apart. Here's the radula sticking out of the beak here, and that beak can tear the prey apart. They can swallow things in big chunks, and you can see down here there are some muscles which control that radula and allow it to operate and tear things apart. So at risk of stating the obvious here, clearly it's the shell that makes the nautilus different from other cephalopods. As you can see here, here's the funnel right there. It still uses jet propulsion in spite of the fact that it has a shell. So how does it stay afloat and enable itself to use jet propulsion when it's got a heavy shell that it's carrying around? As you can see here, there's lots of chambers in this shell. So as the organism grows, it grows out from the center and adds chamber by chamber by chamber, the mantle creating those 2 chambers, and then they block them off. And then they fill the old chambers with gas so that that gas can help them float. You can see here this organ structure called the siphuncle, and this is what actually will remove the water from the chambers and leave the gas behind. Coloration and the ability of the mantle to change color, and make no mistake, it is the mantle that changes color. You can see here the different pigmentation spots there. These are concentrations of pigment in the skin of the, in this case a squid, that can contract and expand based on the little muscle fibers in the cells. The color changes can be for a wide variety of reasons. Here we have some courtship going on. And we can also see that it will be involved in other kinds of communication and territoriality, as well as mating. And you can see here that there's three different situations where squid are using their coloration patterns to communicate something to other squid. Here's a squid down here and one down here. They can match their backgrounds. They can change color in order to blend in with corals and soft corals around them. They use their arms also to display and to communicate. They actually can send particular kinds of signals based on the position of their arms, as well as each of the different color patterns tends to have some kind of communicative meaning depending on the context in which they're in. The blue rings on the blue-ringed octopus, the smallest but also most lethal in terms of venom octopus that we know, are clearly there for warning. They're to communicate to other organisms that this little creature is dangerous. Researchers who keep the cuttlefish in captivity think that these cuttlefish have personality and that they can actually recognize different people and develop relationships with the people that keep them in their tanks. And they've been known to play in our own human conception of what play is. They will squirt water at the lab attendants that they know, and they'll literally engage in different kinds of playful behaviors with them. Octopus can not only change color, but as you can see here, they can really change the texture of the surface of the skin. This enables them to camouflage very well into different kinds of backgrounds. And if you haven't really quite picked it up, the behavioral repertoire of this group of organisms is far more sophisticated than anything we've seen before, and that includes the ability to actually excrete ink out of an ink sac, and this can help camouflage them, and then off they go. Here you can see the ink sac right here, the arrows pointing right up to this little structure here. Notice that it's right near the funnel so that it can release the ink and it gets jetted out of the organism for dispersal. Remember that all these mollusks have an organ level of organization, and in this circumstance what we're really interested in the systems part of things is the circulatory system. So this is a picture of the circulatory system and a couple things that you want to note. First of all, it has a systemic heart right here. And then second of all, it also has these two structures which are called branchial or gill hearts. So 3 hearts in its circulatory system. It's got this closed bed of vessels here, so it's got a closed circulatory system. And it has respiratory pigments, or what we might call blood pigments, right? And that's similar to what we have in our body. We have hemoglobin. These happen to have hemocyanin in their blood, which is a blue pigmented oxygen-carrying pigment. And for at least some of these organisms, having a closed system, 3 hearts, and respiratory pigments that make them more efficient at carrying oxygen, this means that they can have a much more active lifestyle than the bivalves for sure, and the gastropods as well. So here you can see we've got this set of gills. Notice that the gills are small, right? At the base of the gills are those gill hearts, or those branchial hearts right there. The systemic heart is in between. And what we see is that when the squid opens the mantle or increases its diameter, water gets pulled in. That water goes right over the gills, and then when the squid contracts its mantle in order to move, the water gets forced back out again, and some of it will go through the funnel, not all of it, but some will go through the funnel. And so high volumes of water are moved through the organism on a regular basis. This is why they can afford to have these small gills, right? And given that they have 3 hearts to help increase the blood flow, to pump more blood over the gills, right, as an auxiliary pump, and then in addition, they have the hemocyanin pigment to help carry oxygen. All these things make them very efficient at gas exchange and at pumping large volumes of water across these relatively small gills, even though they're highly active. When we look at their nervous system, a couple of things are really quite notable here. Number one, this is the first group that we could actually say has a brain. And this brain is a collection of neurons that happens to actually surround in circular fashion the esophagus. So here's what I can say. These squid have to be careful what they eat. They can't take too big a bite, because look what might happen. The food has to pass right down through the brain, which is surrounding the esophagus. So that's one issue. Secondly, right, they happen to have these remarkably giant axons. So these are a millimeter right, in diameter, which is much bigger than most axons. Here's an actual picture of what these axons look like. So these giant axons right here are responsible for carrying nerve impulses along the muscles of the mantle, and this is what allows them to have both coordinated and very quick muscle contraction, and to do it from the back end out the front end. Because if the contraction came the other way around, they'd be pushing all the water back this way into the back of the mantle, and they'd blow their butts off. So just to go back to the idea of behavior again, here we can see 4 different kinds of behavior in which they are trying to make it hard for other things to see them. Here you can see a squid pretending to be a lot like these soft coral. Here you can see an octopus blending down into the sand, making itself the color of the sand and blending in. Here, a giant Pacific octopus is releasing ink to camouflage itself. And finally, this particular octopus is so well blended into its environment, it can match the color and the texture. So one of the major ways that we gauge the level of sophistication, particularly in behavioral terms, is to look at how complex the organism's behavior is within the species. And here we can see that these 2 squid here and these 2 squid here, they've identified the male here and the female here. And notice that this male here seems to be taking his left arm and actually depositing something inside the mantle cavity of the female. Same idea is happening here. So these squid go through a courtship. They literally engage in courtship behaviors. The males compete against one another, oftentimes for access and the company of the female. And then after that has been carried out and the female has decided on the mate or the male has won, then there's an actual copulation event that takes place in which the male takes with a specially modified arm a sperm packet and delivers that sperm packet into the mantle of the female. After the female receives the packet, she will lay a whole passel of eggs. These are eggs that are inside these little, they call them actually squid candles, and they're inside some protective membrane. And the membrane is so effective that predatory fish can oftentimes not smell them, even though they're there. And they're a remarkable source of food. But they survive because the outer membrane prevents the predators from smelling them. Now, what's interesting about most of these organisms is that they are reproduce once and die organisms. So they pay the ultimate price in order to be able to reproduce. Here we can see a female octopus who's laid her eggs on the roof of this little cave structure, and each one is independent here, this little candle of eggs for this octopus. The octopus actually spends time caring for the eggs. So here we see parental care. This is one of the big indicators in terms of sophistication of behavior and in looking at the behaviors and social constructs within animals. Here are the only invertebrates which show this distinct level of parental care. So the female octopus guards the eggs. She doesn't eat while she guards the eggs for the whole time. And then after the eggs are getting really close to maturity and almost ready to hatch, she will oftentimes die. And here you can see again the mother octopus in here in the cave. Here she is tending eggs over here, and then here are this baby octopus right here having just hatched from the egg. So the question that's on the page is, why are most big octopus and many species male? And all you have to do is think about, so what does the female have to do to tend the eggs? Once she gets to breeding size, she lays her eggs and she tends them, and then she dies. So the males live just a little bit longer. Sometimes the males live another year or 2 years, but not too much longer. So the big octopuses happen to be the old octopuses. And once they are ready to hatch, then they come out of the egg sac there. They've got themselves just enough nutrient material to be able to survive here, and they'll start feeding right quickly off of there, and they live maybe a year for some, 2 years for others, not too much longer than that for the majority of octopus.